Hi, friends. Pastor Heather Hayward here with CJ Webster, a clinical therapist, friend of New Life, and somebody whose face you may know and love. And we wanted to have a conversation today about our mental health through this pandemic. We had talked in August about the sense of grief that we were all sharing. And out of my sense of grief, I reached out to CJ, and we've had a couple of conversations and wanted to have this as a larger conversation than just the two of us.
Yeah.
So the premise of this time together is to talk about our mental and spiritual health.
Yes.
And somebody who has a lot more knowledge about mental health than I do, I am glad that you're here.
I'm very glad to be here. Yeah.
So our hopes for this time together is to kind of get that sense of what this pandemic has really done to our mental health.
Right.
And so what have you been seeing in folks around you
Sure.
in this time?
I mean, I think one of the things that has become really prevalent is that everyone is responding to it differently. It's really easy sometimes to say, should I be feeling this way? Is this the right way to feel? What's happening for other people? And we look for norms, and that's a really healthy social thing to do, is just to look for a norm of where I am. That's how we get our social sort of feedback.
Right.
And yet during this time, we don't have that feedback because we're isolating. We have different family circumstances. We have different challenges that we've got to deal with because our work is changing differently for different people. Our level of health is different, so our risk factors are different. And so a lot of it has been destabilizing of what we thought were the norms, and therefore anxiety and depression is a normal response to that, and just being unsettled.
Yeah, and I've really felt just my own personal sense of early on in the pandemic, like I could not multitask the same way that I had previously.
Right.
And I still don't feel like I've regained that.
Right.
And really, in a lot of ways, some of that is blessing because
Sure.
then I can really be in the moment
Absolutely.
and focused on this task and not 10 other things at the same time. But that's really hard when you're used to accomplishing such and such and such.
Yes, and that's a little bit of that disorganization. We don't have the resources we used to have. Apart from everything else going around, we take for granted that our show is on, or that we can just go for a walk outside, or all these things that just seem really natural in the other time. And that's taken away and our routine has gone. We have less bandwidth. And at the same time, the needs or the concerns have increased the bandwidth on those. So it's almost like the proportion of our self-care has been shifted, and so we have to then focus, and that's often where the multitasking and the ability to think about multiple things starts to move a little.
Yeah. And I was saying that we had talked as a congregation about the sense of grief and loss.
Yeah.
How are you talking with your patients about that, your clients? How are we collectively managing grief?
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the time we talk about grief in very small groups. It's a family or it's an individual who experiences grief. And fortunately, our experience hasn't been very much, at least in a safer communities. There's obviously disadvantaged communities who experience this sort of grief all the time.
Yeah.
And so for those communities, it's even ramped up more, and we've got to look at what is safety. But for other people, they're starting to experience what does collective grief look like. And so there's a couple of things that we do with that. And one of the things is that we start to think about who are you in this? Not losing necessarily this sense of that feedback that we used to get socially was a way that we would start to get who we were at different times. And when we do that, we get sort of an idea of, people give us ideas about who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of what we have to do is continue to look at who am I in this situation and hold on to that, and how do I hold that space and not lose the stuff that I knew about me now that I'm not getting the feedback anymore. So that's something that's come up a lot. The other thing has been being able to focus on what you can change and what you can't. Because often we get into this space where we are used to, okay, I've got this problem, I'm going to solve it. And this is something that collectively we can't do.
Right.
And so we have to start thinking about what in my life do I have control over, and what do I want to choose to do today. And that also builds your sense of self-autonomy. It's often not big things.
Yeah.
It can be a little thing each day that says, this is the one thing I'm going to improve today.
Mm.
And having that ability to control that one thing is that step forward. Sometimes we think too big in these
Yeah.
changes. What we're going through is a big thing, and so we think a big response is needed, but so often it's coming back and coming in and saying, what is the one thing I need to do right now?
Yeah, and those daily routines
Yeah,
too.
right.
Of again, I found myself early on in the quarantine time, kind of March, April, really focused on, okay, every day I'm gonna get up and shower. I'm gonna
Yes.
make breakfast. You know, like those things that established patterns of health really were solid ground. And then as it got a little further on, feeling like, what else could I add to that
Yeah.
would create health? And so, like more time walking outside, or more time in prayer, and that kind of sense of, if I don't have control of this, what do I have control of?
Right, right. And also understanding that when you choose what you have control over and what you don't, that grief is actually a healing process.
Mm.
It helps us prepare for change. It helps us
Oh,
reevaluate.
nice.
And so to push away this thing that's healing and say, well, that's something I can't control, or I have to control my grief, can be really counterproductive. So there's a certain point where, how much do I expose myself to it moving forward so that I can do that healing? And then there's also the part of, how do I not jump in it too far and make this go too quickly?
Right.
And that's something that takes some effort.
Yeah, it's almost, so if I hear you saying this correctly, that like the avoidance of grief makes the grief even worse.
It can, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, we actually call it complicated grief
Mm.
because it's gone on longer than the normal healing processes that would go with grief as a natural thing.
Yeah. I actually heard someone, a jail chaplain, once say that pretty much 99% of the inmates, their issues started in grief that wasn't fully, kind of reconciled with the real world.
Sure.
And so they made other paths of meaning and other choices. And so, yeah, I wonder, we had actually talked in August when we were talking about grief, about that, the sixth stage of grief or whatever, that there is a meaning created out of grief. Like,
Right.
what's the point of this?
Yeah.
And that, I hope we're getting to that point as
Great.
a collective.
Sure.
That I was reading some things about that 6-month wall, and we hit that, and I felt it personally. I felt it kind of communally, like, we're just tired. But I think I also feel this push to either going up and over, or around, or however you get through that wall.
Right.
That I feel like that's happening.
Yes.
And some of it is kind of reconciling our grief and reconciling what's lost.
Yes. And being able to reach out to people and distinguish that, right? So I had a client once who came saying that they were very depressed, and when we talked about it, it actually came out that there was a lot of grief. And that puts a very different spin on then how we're going to address it. So obviously if it's depression and something that's, we've got some biochemical things going in there in life circumstance, then there's a different approach than if it's this grief of social, and then you'll want to reach out to others and find ways to do it.
Yeah.
So being able to understand your circumstance and understand that this is grief, and so therefore how am I going to approach that, is actually part of that process of thinking it through. Where am I? Not just accepting where I am, but where should I be going with this? What is the meaning that can come from this? Positive, negative, confusing. It's probably all in that mix. It's not going to be a simple answer, but you can come out the other side stronger as a result.
And so often people are getting to that point because they've been in interaction with people, and how does that work in isolation?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is that part of the complicated grief cycle that we're in right now? Is like we aren't having face-to-face time with people.
Right. Yes. That's part of the complication and part of why it's hard to move through. Because it is support networks, it's church, it's community of faith that starts to give us context again, that brings us back into what the world's normal routines and things like that are. So when that gets taken away, you are in this spot where you're not getting that feedback, and so it's a very confusing place without any signposts, and without any, is this getting difficult, is this something that's maybe different than you think? And so reaching out and finding opportunities, even though it might be virtual, which we can get into, but it's got its own complications.
And so how are you inviting people to find that sense of community? What seems to be working?
It's, as with everything, and I'll say it all the time, it's different for everyone. But sometimes, although virtual's not my favorite way, I don't like virtual, it's a limited bandwidth of information, it's something. And so sometimes we can minimize it and say, well, it's not good enough, and then we give it up altogether. And so multiple clients have started by saying, I don't want to do this online stuff, it's not the same. But as it's progressed, it's been like, anything is better than nothing. And so I think sometimes it's like, this isn't going to completely satisfy it on its own, but I'm going to make sure regularly I make the connection, because it's filling that bucket a little bit of energy. And so it's part of the puzzle, not necessarily all of it. And it's putting these pieces together. It's not going to be one thing is going to fix this. It's being healthy is a multifaceted approach. And so it's going back to who you are and not losing that. So what's important to me? How am I doing that? It's having predictability, routines, as you talked about, so that there is some constant in life when everything else seems unpredictable. What am I going to have that's predictable? If that's the same breakfast every morning, that might be the thing you pick. That's great. If it's a bedtime routine, that can work. And then it's keeping active. We know there's a strong correlation between our mental health, depression, anxiety, and our level of movement. And it's complicated how that happens, but we do know there's a correlation. So when you're in one place and your walls don't change, your brain also doesn't get new input, and so you tend to stay in the same place. So even getting up and walking out to the letterbox or postbox and coming back in, your brain has had to reorient to new surroundings and new environment, and hence it's getting new information, and then possibilities are happening. It's really hard to get the brain to think of new possibilities when it's looked at the same four walls for the last week.
Right. And I think that's part of the complication of this time, is that sense of loneliness, alone, together but not really. That distance that we have to keep each other safe, and there's a whole host of reasons why we can't be together, but that just complicates all of it.
Right. And a lot of it is also recognizing that in every one of these sorts of things, there is a spark of what is actually healthy, and that's how we got here. So often when I work with people with depression or anxiety, I talk to them about depression often comes about when we lose connection with our values, when we don't have a way for that to live out in the world, when we become disconnected in a certain way. And so it's the natural response trying to restore equilibrium. And there's biochemical reasons why it happens as well. But sometimes it is this lack of connection with what's important in life and things like that. And so if we're starting to feel that, that's almost like a warning sign that, okay, I've got to get back to my values. I have to get back to being able to impact the world in some way. And that will lead me that way. Same with anxiety. Anxiety is actually a really normal response to something provoking us to be ready. So if you ever do a performance or you've got to speak in front of a crowd, that biochemical response that you're experiencing is preparing, stepping up for what you have to do. And that's a really healthy thing to do. What happens is when that never ends, is it becomes a little bit more difficult, and we would call it generalized anxiety or something like that. So it's where it's gone too far, but in knowing that it's gone too far also helps us know, okay, well, I need to know that I don't have to step up today and give myself a little bit of a break here, and that this is not somewhere where I have to perform, this area is safe, and just bringing that back into alignment a little.
Yeah, so it's not this cycle of always having that sense of like what's going to happen next.
Yes.
Which I mean I think is pretty logical given the fact that our world right now seems to change. You know, every time we turn on the news, it's like something changes. So that sense of anxiety feels a little heightened now for all of us.
Right.
Not just folks who already had some anxiety beforehand, before all of this. Now it's added.
Yeah. And so minimizing those triggers is something that's coming up a lot in my room as well, is like, how much news are you watching? How much do you need to watch to be informed? How much of just scary movies are you watching as well, on top of all of that aren't even related, because it's keeping those energy levels up. And how are you letting that out? And again, movement helps with that. It gets the flow of the energy out of our body. When we've got high levels of anxiety, it brings the biochemical things back into alignment. So regulating that and having some simple choices. It's little things, it doesn't solve everything, but it's picking one thing at a time and moving forward.
And that's one of the reasons we wanted to have this conversation is to kind of give some tools and have some open conversation and dialogue and ways to kind of just acknowledge that this is happening. That we're feeling it, you're feeling it, you're feeling, you know, like that in some way to normalize it and say, this is a collective feeling, and you're normal. You're okay. And some of why we wanted to talk about this alone, or separate but together, is this sense that it may look like we are together at the same table, but we are not. And hence the no masks, that if we were really that close together, we would be masked. And
We would.
And I think some of that separateness is really an illusion. That certainly I don't want to deny that we feel it.
Absolutely.
But that it's not, it doesn't have to be debilitating.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if you've ever had the experience where growing up, my parents had these photo albums of us as kids, and you'd open it up and you'd flip through, and suddenly you went back to that place, that memory, or that person that you'd long forgotten, or a grandparent who'd passed, and it suddenly comes back, and it's all very real.
Oh, like the smells of my grandmother's house.
Right. And when things are tough, it's harder to access that. But those things are very real, and we know that in that place, if you put someone in and scan their brain during that, they're essentially back in that place again. So having space to think about where you would like to be, or what you're going to do after this, or remembering your friends or a conversation you had is another thing too. It's this illusion that, are you with them? No. but they're in your thoughts. And that's a very real thing that we've said
Yeah.
for a long time,
Yeah.
but it's very meaningful at the moment.
And I would bring that also around to as we pray for each other.
Yeah.
And the metaphysical changes that happen not only in you but the person that you're praying for, even if they don't know that they're being prayed for. There's studies that show metaphysically things change
Absolutely.
in prayer, and I think that way of being connected to each other is of utmost value right now,
Right.
especially
Yeah.
at all times, but right now especially.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Yes.
Great. Thank you.
No problem.
This is great. This is a great beginning to the conversation. We plan to have 3 more conversations, so stay tuned. We're going to actually talk about the path of the labyrinth as our path through this time. So thank you for joining us for this first episode with CJ and myself. So thanks for being here.